The arrival. It was a gray afternoon in New York City. The streets, wet from a recent drizzle, reflected the glowing neon lights of restaurants and theaters. Among them stood La Rose d'Or, an upscale French restaurant that catered to the elite. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with muted conversations, silverware clinking and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. The maitre d', a tall, slim man named Jacques, prided himself on maintaining an air of exclusivity. Tonight, he would be put to the test. The heavy wooden door swung open, and in walked Sylvester Stallone. Despite being a global icon, Stallone was dressed simply: dark jeans, a navy blue sweater, and a leather jacket draped over his broad shoulders. His face, sculpted by time and hardship, still carried the aura of a fighter. He walked with quiet confidence toward the reception desk. Jacques barely looked up. He saw an older man, dressed modestly, without an extravagant entourage. To him, this was just another guest, not the legendary actor and director who had inspired millions. "Excuse me," Stallone said in a deep, gravelly voice. "Table for one?" Jacques exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers on the reservation book. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" "No," Stallone admitted with a small smile. "I was just in the area. Thought I'd drop by." Jacques sighed dramatically. "I'm afraid we are fully booked." His tone carried the same cold dismissal he had used on countless guests who didn't fit the right image of the restaurant. Stallone glanced around. Several tables were empty. "Looks like you got some space," he said, keeping his voice calm. Jacques forced a tight smile. "They are reserved." Something in Stallone's eyes flickered. A moment of recognition. He had seen this before. The snobbery, the underestimation, the way people judged others based on appearance alone. He had felt it as a struggling actor when he had nothing but a dream and a script for Rocky in his hands. But he didn't argue. He simply nodded. No worries. He turned and walked out into the night, the door closing behind him. Jacques shook his head, already moving on to the next guest. Little did he know, this moment would come back to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. The wind had picked up outside as Sylvester Stallone stepped back onto the wet pavement. The neon lights of New York flickered against the puddles, casting fractured reflections of a city that never cared for sentimentality. He took a deep breath, shaking his head slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had dismissed him like that. Not as a star, but as a man. He had spent his whole life proving people wrong. But tonight, something about it felt different. A few passers-by recognized him, whispering, sneaking glances, but Stallone barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. He wasn't hurt. Not really. He was tired. Tired of people who judged too quickly. Tired of the arrogance that success could breed in those who had never fought for it. Tired of a world that measured worth by the cut of a suit or the name on a guest list. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and started walking. Inside La Rose d'Or, Jacques smirked as he watched Stallone disappear through the restaurant's front window. Another nobody trying to get in without a reservation. The night went on. Glasses clinked. Plates were carried in and out. Conversations hummed, filled with corporate talk and expensive laughter. But then, something changed. At precisely 8:47 p.m., the restaurant doors swung open again. This time, the air shifted. 3 men walked in, well-dressed, their suits crisp, their shoes polished. But it wasn't their clothing that made the room fall silent. It was their presence. Jacques recognized power when he saw it. These were men of influence, the kind who didn't need to raise their voices to command attention. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward and removed his coat, handing it off to a stunned waiter. He had a controlled, calculated demeanor, one that sent a quiet chill through the room. Jacques forced a smile. "Welcome to La Rose d'Or. Do you have a reservation?" The man raised an eyebrow, as if amused by the question. "No." Jacques hesitated. "I'm afraid we're—" "Don't finish that sentence." The man's voice was smooth, but there was an unspoken weight behind it. Jacques swallowed hard. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, black envelope with gold lettering on the side. He placed it carefully on the podium. Jacques looked down at it. A VIP invitation. His pulse quickened. These weren't regular guests. They weren't even the usual wealthy businessmen or celebrities. This was something else. Something bigger. He picked up the envelope with slightly trembling fingers, opening it carefully. Inside was a single card with one name written on it. Jacques' face drained of color. The name was Sylvester Stallone. He looked up, confused. I don't understand. The tall man leaned in just slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. You will. Then he gestured to a table, one of the best in the house. He was supposed to sit there tonight. Jacques' throat went dry. He had turned away the wrong man, and he had no idea just how deeply he would regret it. Jacques' hands trembled slightly as he held the black envelope. The name inside, Sylvester Stallone, felt heavier than paper, as if it carried the weight of a mistake he couldn't take back. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet. The three mysterious men stood patiently, their sharp eyes locked onto Jacques. He cleared his throat, struggling to find his usual air of arrogance. I didn't realize. The tall man cut in, his voice laced with amusement. Didn't realize who you dismissed? Didn't realize that this seat belonged to him. He gestured toward the empty table, still set with a candle flickering atop a pristine white tablecloth. Jacques' mouth opened, but no words came out. He had spent his career looking down on people who didn't fit his idea of elite. He had believed himself untouchable, the silent gatekeeper to a world of privilege. And now he felt exposed. Gentlemen, I assure you, it wasn't intentional, Jacques stammered. The second man, a shorter, stockier figure with salt and pepper hair, leaned in slightly. Not intentional? He gave a cold chuckle. That's the problem with men like you. You think power comes from a guest list. Jacques swallowed hard. Please, if I had known. The third man, the youngest of the three, finally spoke. He's dying, you know. Silence. Jacques blinked. His lips parted, but he couldn't form the words. The young man exhaled. Stallone, he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't want pity. But tonight was supposed to be different. This table wasn't just a table. It was the moment, a memory. And you. He glanced at Jacques with something between pity and disgust. You took that from him. Jacques' stomach twisted into knots. The third man's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you even know what tonight was? Jacques barely shook his head. The older man answered for him. His last night in New York. The word struck like a thunderclap. Stallone dying? Jacques' mind reeled. He suddenly felt small, insignificant in the grander scheme of things. His gaze flickered back to the empty table. It was no longer just a wasted seat. It was a stolen moment, a memory that should have existed but never would, and it was his fault. Jacques tried to speak, but his throat was dry. I didn't know. The tall man sighed, straightening his jacket. You should have. And with that, the three men turned and walked out, leaving Jacques standing there, haunted by what he had just learned. Outside, the night swallowed them whole. And somewhere in the city, Sylvester Stallone walked alone. The rain fell heavier, and for the first time in his life, Jacques felt something he had never felt before, regret. The streets of New York had a way of swallowing people whole. Sylvester Stallone walked aimlessly, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, the cold air biting at his face. The city had changed, or maybe he had. The bright lights and the energy still pulsed, but he felt disconnected from it all. That restaurant, he had expected nothing fancy, just a quiet meal, a chance to sit, to reflect, maybe even to say goodbye. But instead, he had been reminded of something cruel. Time may have made him a legend, but it hadn't made him untouchable. He stopped in front of a darkened store window, looking at his own reflection. The face staring back was weathered, lined with the battles of life. A face the world knew. A face that once symbolized resilience. And yet, tonight, he felt small. For the first time in a long time, Sylvester Stallone felt like that young, struggling actor again. The one who slept in bus stations, who had to sell his dog just to survive. The one who had begged studios to give Rocky a chance. He wasn't the underdog anymore. But somehow, tonight, he felt like one. A gust of wind carried the scent of the city, wet concrete, distant pizza parlors, the faint sting of gasoline. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of something across the street. An old Italian restaurant. Small, unassuming, nothing like the cold elegance of La Rose d'Or. The windows glowed warmly, and inside, people laughed, real laughter, not the hollow, performative kind. A young couple shared a plate of pasta, leaning in close. An elderly man at the bar sipped a glass of red wine, lost in thought. A waiter with rolled-up sleeves joked with a table of regulars. It was a life. Stallone hesitated for a moment, then crossed the street and pushed open the door. The smell hit him instantly: garlic, tomatoes, fresh bread. The kind of food that reminded him of home, of his mother's kitchen, of simpler days. A short, stocky man behind the counter looked up. "Welcome, my friend. You hungry?" Stallone smiled, nodding. Yeah, I think I am." No questions, no judgment, just a seat, a plate, and warmth. As he sat down, he let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. And for the first time that night, he felt human again. Meanwhile, back at La Rose d'Or, Jacques had never felt this way before. Guilt gnawed at him, like a hunger he couldn't satisfy. He had spent years turning people away, making snap judgments, deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. Tonight, he had turned away a man who had spent his entire life proving people like him wrong. And now, he was haunted by the words of that last visitor. "He's dying." Jacques paced in the back, running a hand through his hair. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it back down. What was he supposed to do? Call him? Apologize? Would it even matter? He thought about the empty table. The candle still flickered, untouched. A sudden, crushing weight settled on his chest. For the first time in his life, Jacques wished he could take something back. Jacques sat in his office at La Rose d'Or, his hands clasped together, staring blankly at the black envelope on his desk. His mind was a battlefield. Thoughts clashing, memories resurfacing, regret sinking its teeth into his pride. He's dying. The words looped in his head, each repetition a hammer striking his ribs. For the first time, Jacques felt something foreign: shame. He had built his entire career on exclusivity, believing that prestige was measured by who he let in and who he turned away. But tonight, he had denied entry to a man who had fought his entire life for respect, a man who had become a legend, a man who, according to those strangers, wouldn't be around for much longer. Jacques exhaled sharply and grabbed his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen. What would he even say? "Mr. Stallone, I apologize for treating you like you were beneath me, but now that I know you're famous and worse dying, I suddenly care?" He clenched his jaw. No, that wasn't an apology. That was guilt looking for absolution. Still, something in his gut twisted. He had to try. With trembling fingers, he dialed the private number listed inside the envelope. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice. "Hello." Jacques' mouth went dry. "Mr. Stallone?" A long pause. Then a different voice, calm, measured, but unmistakably firm. "Who is this?" Jacques swallowed. "My name is Jacques. I manage La Rose d'Or. I wanted to speak with Mr. Stallone." Silence. Then, the voice on the other end said something that made Jacques' blood turn cold. "You missed your chance." The line went dead. Jacques stared at his phone, heart hammering against his ribs. Missed his chance? What did that mean? His fingers curled into fists as a sickening realization crept in. What if he was already too late? Meanwhile, across town, at the small Italian restaurant, Sylvester Stallone sat in a quiet corner, twirling a fork through a plate of spaghetti and meatballs. It was the kind of meal that didn't need to be fancy to be perfect. A young waiter approached, smiling nervously. "Excuse me, sir. I just wanted to say, you're my hero." Stallone looked up, surprised. The kid couldn't have been more than 20. He had that look, the hungry look of someone chasing a dream, just like Stallone once had. Stallone set his fork down and smiled. "Thanks, kid." The waiter hesitated. When I was a kid, my dad and I used to watch Rocky together. He always said, it ain't about how hard you hit." Stallone finished the line with a small chuckle. "It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." The kid grinned. Yeah, a pause. Then, the waiter asked, "Are you okay, sir?" Stallone tilted his head. "Why?" The kid shrugged. "I don't know. You look like you got a lot on your mind." Stallone exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, kid," he said after a moment. "I do." He looked around the restaurant. The warmth, the laughter, the life happening all around him. This was what he had wanted. Not the fame, not the money, just the feeling of being real, of being part of something, of being seen. Not as a star, but as a man. And tonight, in this tiny restaurant filled with strangers, he had found it. He lifted his glass of red wine and took a slow sip. It tasted like home. And for the first time in a long time, Sylvester Stallone smiled. Not for a camera, not for an audience, but for himself. The next morning, Jacques awoke feeling unrest. The events of the night before churned in his mind. The cold dismissal, the black envelope, the phone call that ended with those haunting words. "You missed your chance." He had barely slept. Even as the sun crept into the sky, something inside him felt off. Still, he had a restaurant to run. Jacques showered, dressed, and made his way to La Rose d'Or, slipping into his usual polished demeanor. He was a man of routine. He would push the guilt down. He always did. But when he stepped into the restaurant and glanced at the bar's television, everything changed. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen. Hollywood legend Sylvester Stallone hospitalized overnight. Jacques froze. The anchor's voice rang out in the silent room. Actor and filmmaker Sylvester Stallone, beloved for his roles in Rocky and Rambo, was admitted to a New York hospital last night after reportedly collapsing in a small Italian restaurant. Details remain unclear, but sources close to the star confirm he has been battling a private illness for some time. Jacques' breath caught. The screen cut to a shaky cell phone video taken inside the restaurant. People gasping, a waiter rushing to Stallone's side. His head lolled slightly, his breathing shallow. The last thing caught on camera, Stallone whispering something. The reporter continued, though unconfirmed. Witnesses say Stallone was heard saying one word before he lost consciousness. Something about a restaurant. Jacques' skin went cold. He already knew the word before the reporter said it. He reportedly whispered, "Rose." Jacques staggered backward, gripping the edge of the bar to steady himself. Doctors say the 77-year-old remains in critical condition. Fans worldwide have flooded social media with messages of support, hoping for a miracle. The screen flashed with tweets, pictures, videos of fans outside the hospital holding signs that read, "Stay strong, slide and one more round." Jacques' heart pounded. Had he really done this? Had he really turned away a dying man? Had he been the last face of rejection Stallone had ever seen? His hand shook as he grabbed his phone, dialing the number from the black envelope again. Straight to voicemail. He clenched his jaw, then made a sudden decision. He had to go to that hospital. He had to see Stallone, even if it was too late. Meanwhile, in a hospital room, the world outside buzzed with news of his condition, but inside, Stallone lay in silence. Machines beat softly, and Ford dripped beside him. He was weak. He had known this was coming. But what he hadn't expected was the kindness he had found last night, the laughter in that small restaurant, the warmth of strangers who hadn't cared about his fame. That moment had been real, and yet, as the world worried over him, his mind drifted somewhere else, to La Rose d'Or, to that empty table, to the man who had looked at him like he was nothing. A faint whisper escaped his lips. Rose? Somewhere in his fogged thoughts he wondered, would that man feel regret? And more importantly, would it even matter? Jacques had never driven so fast in his life. The roads blurred past as he weaved through Manhattan's morning traffic, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced even faster. You missed your chance. No, he hadn't. Not yet. The news report had said Stallone was still alive, still fighting. Jacques didn't know what he was chasing. A moment, a second chance, an absolution he didn't deserve. But he knew one thing. If Sylvester Stallone opened his eyes again, Jacques needed to be there. The hospital doors. The entrance to New York Presbyterian Hospital was swarmed with reporters, fans, and cameras flashing like 1,000 tiny suns. Jacques pushed his way through the crowd, his usual air of arrogance stripped away, replaced with something raw. Excuse me. I need to get inside. Please. I need to see him. The security guard barely spared him a glance. Family only. Jacques swallowed hard. I work at La Rose d'Or. The guard raised an eyebrow. And Jacques' breath caught in his throat. And what? And I turned him away. And I made him feel like nothing on what might have been his last night in New York. And I regret it more than anything I've ever done in my life. He stood there, frozen, as the realization slammed into him like a freight train. There was nothing he could say. Because who was he to be here? Who was he to ask for forgiveness from a man who had given the world so much, when all Jacques had ever done was take? The security guard's radio crackled. No more visitors. And just like that, Jacques was locked out. The doors closed in front of him, and he was left standing in a sea of strangers, unable to do a damn thing. Inside the hospital room, the world outside buzzed with cameras, headlines, breaking news updates. But inside, it was quiet. Sylvester Stallone lay still, his breath shallow, the weight of the years pressing down on him. A nurse adjusted his four. The doctor murmured to a colleague about test results. Somewhere, a heart monitor beeped steadily, a slow but constant rhythm. Then a flicker. His fingers twitched. The nurse noticed first. Mr. Stallone? A soft groan. Then a deeper breath. His eyelids fluttered. And just like that, Sylvester Stallone opened his eyes. The nurse's voice wavered. He's awake. The doctor stepped forward. Mr. Stallone, can you hear me? A long pause. Then the slowest of nods. The doctor exhaled in relief. You had us worried there. But Stallone barely heard him. His mind was somewhere else. His throat was dry, but he managed to rasp out a single word. Rose. The nurse frowned. Rose. Stallone turned his head slightly, staring at the ceiling as a memory flickered behind his tired eyes. He wasn't thinking about the hospital, or the doctors, or the fans waiting outside. He was thinking about that restaurant, that empty table, and the man who had turned him away. A faint, tired smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. It was funny in a way. Even after all these years, he was still fighting for his place. Outside the hospital, Jacques stood motionless, his breath fogging in the cold air. He wanted to move, to fight his way in, to do something, but he couldn't, because for the first time in his life, there was nowhere left for him to go. Jacques sat on the curb outside the hospital, elbows on his knees, hands clenched together. He had never felt small before, not once in his life. And yet, here he was, a man who had spent years controlling the doors of exclusivity, now unable to enter the one place that truly mattered. The weight in his chest felt unbearable. He had no right to be here, but he also couldn't leave. His mind drifted back to last night, to the way Stallone had looked at him, to the moment that never should have happened. You missed your chance. Jacques inhaled sharply. Maybe that was true. Maybe Stallone would never know the regret twisting inside him. But he needed to try. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pen and a folded notepad. He had never written an apology in his life, and now, under the cold gray sky, he had no choice but to start. The letter. Mr. Stallone, I do not deserve your time, nor do I expect forgiveness. But I need to say this. Last night, I looked at you and saw only a man who did not belong in my restaurant. I did not see Sylvester Stallone. I did not see the fighter, the dreamer, the man who inspired millions. I did not see the weight of your years, the battles you have fought, the things you have built. I only saw what I wanted to see, and I was wrong. I turned you away without knowing that, in doing so, I was turning away a moment that could never be replaced, a moment you will never get back. For that, I am ashamed, and though it may mean nothing, I need you to know I see you now. I only wish I had seen you sooner. Jacques. Jacques exhaled, staring at the paper. What now? He couldn't hand it to Stallone. He wasn't allowed inside. He looked up at the hospital entrance, then spotted a nurse stepping out for a smoke. Jacques stood, hesitating only for a second before approaching her. "Excuse me," he said. His voice, usually confident, refined, sounded foreign even to himself. "I know I have no right to ask for this, but could you please deliver this to Mr. Stallone?" The nurse raised an eyebrow, glancing at the note. "Are you a friend of his?" Jacques swallowed. "No." He shook his head. "I'm someone who made a mistake." The nurse studied him for a moment, then sighed, taking the letter. "No promises," she said, tucking it into her pocket. Jacques gave a tight nod. It was more than he deserved. And then, for the first time in years, he turned away from a door, knowing he could never walk through it. Inside the hospital room, Stallone lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of memories. The Italian restaurant, the warmth, the laughter, and then La Rose d'Or, the way that man had looked at him, the rejection that had stung, not because of pride, but because, even after everything, he still had to prove his worth. The door creaked open. A nurse stepped inside. "Mr. Stallone, someone left this for you." She handed him a folded letter. His tired hands trembled slightly as he opened it. As he read, his expression didn't change. His lips didn't move. But something in his eyes shifted. And then, after a long pause, a chuckle. It was weak, barely a breath, but it was there. The nurse frowned. "Sir?" Stallone shook his head, still staring at the paper. "Would you look at that?" He murmured, voice hoarse. The son of a bitch actually learned something. The nurse blinked. "I'm sorry." Stallone just smiled faintly, folding the letter and placing it beside him. "I think I just won." And with that, he closed his eyes. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Sylvester Stallone lay still, the weight of the years pressing on his body, but inside, his mind was sharper than ever. The letter sat beside him, its creased edges worn from his fingers, tracing over it again and again. Jacques! The man had written his apology, but Stallone knew better than anyone. Words were easy. It was action that defined a person. A memory flickered in his mind, one he had buried for years. He was young, struggling, walking into an agent's office, a copy of Rocky in his hands. He had believed in himself, in his story, in what he could do. But the agent had barely looked at him before tossing the script back. "You don't belong in this industry, kid." Those words had nearly broken him. Nearly, because he had fought anyway. Now, decades later, after everything, after building a legacy out of pure grit, he had been looked at the same way once more. Jacques had dismissed him the way that agent once had. The only difference? Jacques had realized it, and that That meant something. Stallone smirked weakly, then reached for the small remote beside his bed. His fingers hovered over the call button for the nurse. He had a decision to make. Meanwhile, across town, Jacques sat alone at a small cafe, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He had left the hospital with a weight in his chest that wouldn't leave. What now? Had Stallone even read the letter? Would it matter if he had? For the first time, Jacques found himself in a position he couldn't control. No reputation, no power, no influence could erase what had happened. All he could do was wait. And then his phone rang. Jacques' breath caught in his throat. Unknown number. His hands trembled slightly as he answered. Hello. A long pause. Then, that voice. Gravelly. Strong despite the years. Hey, kid. Jacques' heart nearly stopped. It was him. Sylvester Stallone. Inside the hospital room. Stallone lay back, holding the phone to his ear, listening to the silence on the other end. Jacques wasn't speaking. He was probably too shocked to. Good. Let him sit in it. Finally, Stallone exhaled. You wrote me a letter. Jacques' voice came through, hesitant. Yes. I meant every word. Stallone was quiet for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. You ever get punched in the face before, Jacques? Jacques hesitated. No. Stallone smirked. Well, you just did. You just don't know it yet. The line went quiet. Jacques swallowed hard. Listen. Stallone interrupted. You think I haven't met 100 men like you? You think I don't know how the world works? I do. I've lived it. I fought against it my whole life. A pause. But here's the thing, most of them don't ever see it. Jacques' throat tightened. Stallone continued, voice softer now. You did. A silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. And then, the unexpected. Come see me. Jacques' breath caught. What? You want to make things right? You don't do it with words. You do it with action. Jacques sat frozen in the cafe, the weight of Stallone's words crashing into him. You got one shot at this, Stallone murmured. Don't blow it. Click. The call ended. Jacques stared at his phone. A moment passed. Then another. And then he was running. Jacques had never moved so fast in his life. The cafe door slammed behind him as he ran, dodging through New York's crowded sidewalks, his breath sharp and uneven. He didn't know why he was running, only that he had to, because Sylvester Stallone had given him something he didn't deserve, a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Inside the hospital room, Stallone sat up in bed, watching the rain slide down the window. His body was weak, but his mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in years. He had made his decision. He had spent his life fighting, for roles, for respect, for every inch of ground he had ever gained. And last night, when Jacques had looked at him with that expression, that cold, dismissive look, it had felt like stepping back in time, like being that struggling kid again, pounding on locked doors. But this time, the man on the other side had actually realized he was wrong. That was rare. And Stallone respected a fighter. The nurse poked her head into the room. Mr. Stallone, you have a visitor. Stallone smirked. Let him in. The moment of truth. Jacques stepped into the room, his heart hammering in his chest. Stallone looked up at him, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in his body. Neither man spoke. Then, Stallone nodded to the chair beside his bed. Sit. Jacques hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the chair, his hands clasped together. Another beat of silence. Then, Stallone let out a small chuckle. You know, kid, I've met a lot of people in my life. Some of 'em are good. Some of 'em are bad. And some just don't know who the hell they are yet. Jacques swallowed hard. And which one am I? Stallone tilted his head, studying him. You're still figuring it out. Jacques looked down ashamed. I was an idiot. Stallone snorted. Yeah, you were. Jacques winced. But then Stallone smiled. "But you're here." Jacques slowly looked up. "And that—" Stallone leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. "That means you're not an idiot anymore." The words hit Jacques harder than any insult ever could, because this wasn't pity. This was respect. And for the first time in his life, Jacques truly understood what that meant. The final words. They sat in silence for a long time. Two men who had nothing in common but this one unspoken moment. Then Stallone sighed. "You know, Jacques, life ain't about how hard you hit." Jacques smiled faintly. "It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." Stallone chuckled. "Damn right." A pause. Then Stallone extended his hand. "We good." Jacques stared at the hand in front of him. For a man who had spent his whole life deciding who was worthy of being let in, this was the first time he was the one being offered entry. Jacques took a breath, then shook Stallone's hand. "Yeah." His voice was steady. "We're good." Epilogue. The last visit. A week later, Sylvester Stallone left the hospital. The world celebrated. Fans rejoiced. Headlines read, "The champ is back." But one story never made the news. A story about a man who had spent his whole life locking doors, until one night, when he had closed the wrong one. A story about regret, about redemption, about a lesson learned too late, but not so late that it couldn't be made right. Jacques never worked at La Rose d'Or again. A few months later, a new restaurant opened in the city. It wasn't fancy. It didn't have a dress code. It didn't have velvet ropes or exclusivity. But it had warmth. It had life. It had people. And on the wall, framed for everyone to see, was a simple, handwritten letter. A letter that began with an apology and ended with a name, Sylvester Stallone.